Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this continuing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to a Tuesday edition of the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. It is Tuesday, the 25th day of August in the year 2015, and we welcome you to another edition of the Virtual Center. I want to thank you for your willingness to give us your time, and of course, many of us are aware that in today's complex, fast-moving world, time seems to be the most valuable asset most of us have. I encourage you to use the phone line we have available. I was just looking out the window and I saw this monstrous dog staring at me. Somebody's dog got loosed in the neighborhood, I guess. So I paused. I was a little bit stunned. It was kind of we were playing chicken to see which one of us moved first. I invite you to participate actively in our program by taking advantage of the number that we have made available that will get you on the air. Our phone number is area code 304-663-4676. 304-663-4676. If you'd like to email me directly with your thoughts on the issues that we are dealing with here at the Virtual Center, I would love to hear from you. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. waobrien906@gmail.com. And again, O'Brien is B-R-I-E-N, not A-N, and that's all one word, lowercase. waobrien906@gmail.com. And I remind you that we do have a Facebook page. If you go to Facebook and type in the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, you will gain access to our Facebook page. And I took the liberty after the program yesterday of posting the article that we made reference to at the beginning of yesterday's program, the article that appeared in yesterday's Charleston Gazette. And then about 45 minutes before we went on the air today, I posted a very short posting about what I thought would be the program today, what was seeming lining up as the likely gist of our conversation today. And I invite you to take advantage of the postings on the Virtual Center and feel free to take advantage of the comment opportunities that are available. I might say, before we get back into the theme that we were developing yesterday, which was based on the document written in April of 1787, 1 month before the convening of the Constitutional Convention, the next month, Madison sent a draft document out to his close friends' correspondents, which he entitled Vices of the Political System of the United States. And in that document, he listed 12 major concerns he had about what was happening in the nation under the Articles of Confederation as kind of the background for the looming convention, which was going to seek a solution to these problems. And of course, that solution is becomes the draft of the Constitution of the United States, which begins when Madison makes the document available to the convention through Governor Randolph of Virginia. Actually, Governor Randolph introduces the measure, the Virginia Plan, but it was drafted by James Madison. And that becomes the focus for the debates of the Constitutional Convention throughout the summer of 1787, and of course with changes and with amendments and compromises and negotiated alterations. The Virginia Plan becomes, with substantial changes, the Constitution of the United States. And again, our theme from yesterday was to contrast some of the substance that Madison lays out in his document on the vices of the political system, to compare it with much of what we looked at over the last 3 weeks of programs here on Federalist number 10. And the point I was making is that Madison does not have to be as evasive and as careful in private correspondence as he does in what he publishes in the newspaper. So consequently, there's quite a bit of analysis necessary to really understand the full implications and ramifications of Federalist number 10. Whereas in this document, which he writes to colleagues and friends, he's able to be a little bit more outspoken. He's able to say what he means rather than just imply what he means, if that makes sense. And consequently, if you can compare the two, and the little short posting, the short posting that I put on Facebook earlier today made the point that much of what Madison is saying in Vices of the Political System of the United States confirms what analysis of Federalist number 10 seems to imply. So I think we're right on with our analytical conclusions about about Federalist number 10 if we look at the vices of the political system that Madison drafts, which I think pretty much confirms much of what we concluded in the about the Constitution of the United States and the ways that Madison believed that it would resolve some of the problems under the Articles of Confederation. We do invite you to weigh in on some of these issues, whether you do it by picking up the phone and calling us and letting us chat on the air about your concerns and your ideas, your thoughts, your suggestions, or again, if you choose to share your thinking in an email, I would love to hear from you. And very honestly, I received 2 extremely substantive, very, very rich, meaningful emails since we were last together yesterday here at the Virtual Center. And I want to devote a portion of today's program to the substance of those emails. To be very honest with you, I believe that they are so meaningful and so substantive that it's quite likely that we'll not be able to get through both of them in one hit today. And I remind you that today's program is our last live program here at the Virtual Center until the day after Labor Day. As I had mentioned yesterday, we will not be doing a program tomorrow, as we usually do, and this is a personal appointment on my part. I have a conflict, and so I'm forced to miss tomorrow's program. Next week's programs will be archived programs from previous issues taken up here at the Virtual Center. I will be out of town next week. And the following week, the Monday of that week, is Labor Day. And in talking it over before we went on the air today with Bob thinks that maybe we ought to forego a Labor Day program since a lot of people will not expect it to be on in the middle of the day on Labor Day and probably won't be tuned in anyway. So our first program, live program here at the Virtual Center after today will be on Tuesday, which will be the 8th day of September in the year 2015. As you will recall, if you've been with us on a regular basis, and especially if you were with us yesterday, we began to look at a few very specific items from Madison's document entitled Vices of the Political System of the United States. And as an introduction to this document yesterday, a reintroduction, because we've been through this entire document before, some months ago, in fact, I went through and identified each of the 12 vices that Madison lists in this communique, in this letter, that he sends to close allies and colleagues. But I wanted to focus specifically on those items which pertain directly to the materials contained later the next year in Federalist number 10. And of course, we've spent quite a bit of time over the last 3 weeks on Federalist number 10. Specifically, where I wanted to put my time here today is in items number 10 and 11. 10 being the mutability of the laws of the states. 11 being the injustice of the laws of the states. And Madison addresses each of these in some detail. The first one, number 10, mutability of the laws of the states, refers specifically to the degree to which the laws in the states under the Confederation change so frequently. And with 13 different states, with legislatures passing their own legislation, Madison becomes concerned because there are so many laws on so many different things that it's impossible for citizens to really know what the law is. Because literally, as you move from one state to the other, the laws change. So that's one of the corrections, one of the things that Madison believes the Constitution of the United States will repair. It will create stability, and it will create unity in the laws, so that if there is a federal source of laws passed by a federal legislature, a Congress, as the Constitution provides, then Madison believes that the people will have a much better idea of what the law is, plus the fact that since there is a national law that applies to citizens in all states, then the very existence of the federal legislation creates a degree of unity and a sense of togetherness and community within the nation that is impossible so long as the states remain free and independent states. But what bothers Madison specifically in item number 10 is what he refers to as the mutability of the laws. How not only do they pass and do they vary from state to state, but they change so rapidly and so quickly. He says, we daily see laws repealed or superseded before any trial can be made of their merits, and even before a knowledge of them can have reached the remoter districts within which they were to operate. In the regulations of trade, this instability becomes a snare not only to our citizens but to foreigners also. What Madison is talking about, of course, is that laws are passed and immediately changed or rescinded without really giving them a fair chance to be successful. In other words, we are denying, Madison believes, we are denying ourselves the benefits of experience because we're not giving these laws which legislatures passed believing that they would be a good thing, yet they're being changed so quickly as legislatures change, as representatives, elected representatives change. Then the new group passes laws replacing the previous laws, and that constant change without real analysis and the ability to gain and learn from experience is lost. And of course, the issue here, why do they change as legislatures change? And of course, the answer to that is self-interest. That a new group of legislators come in, and they don't like the law that's on the books that was passed by the previous legislature, so they put a law on the books which better confirms or matches their own self-interest at that particular time. So basically, in his concern with mutability of the laws, what Madison is really saying here, what really disturbs him, is that the frequent changes in the law reflect the power of self-interest rather than principle. Laws are being passed not because they subscribe to or conform to a particular principle. Rather, they conform to the self-interests of the people passing them. So it seems to me, and again, he doesn't say this, but this seems to be sort of implied in this particular section of the document. Madison would seem to believe that with the Constitution of the United States, we would be passing legislation based on reason and common sense and principle, rather than on the whims of self-interest. And of course, that is one of the ways that Madison believes the Constitution will resolve this particular portion, this particular vice in this list of 12 vices that Madison has. And then number 11, the 11th vice, and this is the one that gets most of the attention in this document. Number 11, the injustices of the laws of the states. And basically, he's concerned about this because he said it brings more into question the fundamental principle of Republican government, that the majority who rule in such governments are the safest guardian both of public good and of private rights. So, in a sense, what Madison is saying is the injustices in the legislation being passed in the states threatens the very foundation of Republican government. Self-interest, factions, threaten the whole basis of Republican government, which is that the majority of the people who call the shots in a republic are the best, safest guardians both of the public good and private rights. Republican government is based on the principle that the people are the best guarantors, the best protectors, not only of the public interest, but also the rights of the individual rights of minorities. Because Republican government, as we'll remember, is based on the assumption that civic virtue will rule the day. Republican government is based on the assumption that civic virtue exists. Not only that it exists, but that it rules. That means that civic virtue must overcome the pressures and the power of self-interest, which means it must overcome the realities of faction, of interest groups. Therefore, as we learned in Federalist number 10, Madison doesn't address this specifically here, but as we learned in number 10, Madison's challenge is to create within the constitutional framework a system whereby public virtue, the public interest, the common good can not only surface, but can actually become dominant over self-interest, over the private interests of those who are passing the laws and sitting in Congress and in legislatures as elected representatives. So Madison's formula of refining and enlarging the public views in Federalist number 10 is the process whereby Madison wants to refine or to filter out or to distill self-interest out of the process, and therefore allow public virtue to dominate. Madison says under this item, under number 11, the injustice of the state laws, that there are two causes for this injustice. One cause lies in the representatives themselves, in the representative bodies, the legislatures. The other cause resides within citizens, within the people themselves. And so Madison is going to set out and address each of those. The first one we covered at the end of yesterday's program. It will be review. The second, however, we didn't complete, and that's the one that we will devote the bulk of our attention to, at least for the first portion of our program today. Madison says that representative appointments, those who run for legislatures for election as representatives of the people, do so for three reasons, three motives: ambition, personal interest, and the public good. People run for office for three reasons. They are ambitious, they are driven by their own self-interest, or they genuinely want to contribute to the public good. Madison says, unhappily, the first two are proved by experience to be most prevalent. Most of the time, unfortunately, Madison says, representatives are in it either because of ambition, personal interest, or a combination of the two. Unfortunately, Madison says, concern for the public interest usually comes in a distant third. Hence, Madison says, the candidates who feel the ambition and the personal interest, particularly the second, personal interest, are most industrious and are most successful in pursuing their object and forming often a majority in the legislative councils with interested views contrary to the interest and views of their constituents, join in a perfidious sacrifice of the latter to the former. In other words, they sacrifice the views of their constituents in favor of their own self-interest. So, as Madison says, if most of the people who run for legislatures do so for personal interest or for personal ambition, then it stands to reason that when they get elected, they're going to end up in a legislative body with other people who are also driven by self-interest and ambition. And what that will do is give them the opportunity to combine, to join together, and thereby enact in legislation their self-interest. And in the process, the interests of their constituents, the public good, as it were, loses out. A succeeding election, he says, might be supposed to displace the offenders. In other words, once we see that self-interest is driving particular representatives, we can get rid of them at the next election. One would assume that that's true. In other words, we are told throughout our lives as citizens of this country that in our electoral process, the ballot box, the vote, the suffrage, is the way we get rid of bad representatives and replace them with good ones. In other words, the power of the citizens is in the ballot box, we are told. Madison, however, points out that this may be true in theory, but not in reality, not in fact. How easily, he said, are base and selfish measures masked by pretext of public good and apparent expediency. As elected representatives, these people are sharp. They are smooth. And they are able, Madison says, to color their own self-interest and make it appear that it's really the public interest that they're carrying out. How frequently, he says, will a repetition of the same arts and industry which succeeded in the first instance again prevail on the unwary to misplace their confidence? How frequently, too, will the honest and unenlightened representative become the dupe of a favorite leader, veiling his selfish views under the professions of public good and varnishing his sophisticated arguments with the glowing colors of popular eloquence. What a beautifully written sentence that is. Madison says that even the honest representatives who are in there trying to do the right thing will oftentimes fall under the influence of particular leaders who are masters at shielding their own selfish interests under the cover, under the guise of the public good. And thereby they enlist the support of well-intentioned but rather ignorant representatives who might be there. This is the problem as far as the representative bodies are concerned. Now Madison, in this document, addresses the second cause of the injustices of the laws of the states. And the second cause lies within the people themselves. Madison said a still more fatal, if not more frequent cause of injustice lies among the people themselves. All civilized society, Madison said, are divided into different interests and factions. Here's what becomes Federalist number 10. All civilized societies are divided into different interests and factions as they happen to be creditors or debtors, rich or poor, husbandmen, merchants or manufacturers, members of different religious sects, followers of different political leaders, inhabitants of different districts, owners of different kinds of property, etc., etc., etc. And Madison, in his letter, includes the etc. sign 3 times. So what he's basically saying is these are the kinds of things that make factions part of the system. We got to deal with it. In Republican government, Madison says, the majority, however composed, ultimately give the law. Whenever, therefore, an apparent interest or common passion unites a majority, what is to restrain them from unjust violations of the rights and interests of the minority or of individuals? Since there are so many factions, and since by definition Republican government functions according to the will of the majority, what's to restrain the majority from taking advantage of the fact that they are the majority? Why wouldn't they use their power as a member of the majority to carry out their self-interest? What's to prevent them from doing this, Madison says? And then he supplies the answer. 3 things only, 3 motives only, he says. 1, a prudent regard to their own good as involved in the general and permanent good of the community. Concern for right and wrong, what's right, is the first check. And then Madison admits, this consideration, although of decisive weight in itself, is found by experience to be too often unheeded. It is too often forgotten by nations as well as by individuals that honesty is the best policy. So the first check on self-interests of the majority is a concern for what's good, what's right. And Madison says, however much we wish we could say otherwise, the fact of the matter is that particular check doesn't work very well. So then he goes to number 2, the second check, respect for character. Respect, self-respect, concern for what it will look like if it appears that you are doing things which are in your own best interest. So respect for character, respect for your reputation, for your good name, Madison is saying. However strong this motive may be in individuals, Madison says, it is considered as very insufficient to restrain them from injustice. Even individuals find ways to rationalize what they want to do. So even when they're acting alone, all by themselves, concern for their own reputation, their own good name, frequently is not enough to control their self-interest. Man is able to find ways to rationalize behavior, to make things that he knows are wrong appear to be right, and oftentimes to convince himself of that. In a multitude, its efficacy is diminished in proportion to the number which is to share the praise or the blame. If concern for character doesn't work to check individual behavior, then we know that when individuals get into groups, factions, concern for character becomes almost invisible. It doesn't exist at all. If it doesn't have much chance controlling the behavior of the individual, then we have to conclude that we don't have much of a chance that concern for character will control the behavior of factions. Besides, Madison says, as it has reference to public opinion, which within a particular society is the opinion of the majority, the standard is fixed by those whose conduct is to be measured by it. In other words, if the majority agrees with you, then that in itself becomes the justification for saying it's right. And one of the classic philosophical questions that I think is really worth almost every class that I've ever taught, at some point you really need to lay out the philosophical quandary. How do we define what's right? And one way we've chosen to do it in our society is majority rule. We have oftentimes assumed that if the majority say something is right, it is. Obviously, of course, if you agree with that, then what that means is if the majority changes and changes the definition of what's right, then there is no such thing as absolute right and absolute wrong if it's a function of a particular majority at a particular point in time. So I think most of us who will say majority rules don't take the issue deeply enough to really fully investigate and analyze what that means. And then, of course, he says, public opinion outside society will be little respected by anybody within it. He said, individuals of extended views and of national pride may bring the public proceedings to this standard, but the example will never be followed by the multitude. You know, oftentimes somebody will say, hey guys, we shouldn't do this. But even though it's out there for everybody to consider, it rarely stands much of a chance. The multitude almost never goes for it. Is it to be imagined, Madison says, that an ordinary citizen or even an assemblyman of Rhode Island, in estimating the policy of paper money, ever considered or cared in what light the measure would be viewed in France or Holland, or even in Massachusetts or Connecticut? In other words, once the majority within your particular group, the particular representative body that you're sitting in, decides to do something, what people outside in other states or other countries might think about what you're doing really doesn't carry much weight in those situations. He says it was a sufficient temptation to both that it was their interest. It was a sufficient sanction to the latter that it was popular in the state, to the former that it was so in the neighborhood. So Madison is saying then that the first check on self-interest, which would cause people to do something that they know is wrong, is concern for the public interest, for what's right. And Madison said that almost never has a chance. And then the second one is character, your good name, what other people will think of you. And Madison said that doesn't have much control either. Because when you are the member, when you are part of a majority, the power of the majority will offset the criticism you receive from somebody else outside. The third check, Madison says here, is religion. Will religion, the only remaining motive, be a sufficient restraint? Madison says it is not pretended to be such on men individually considered. In other words, we know that religion too often does little to control behavior of individuals. Will its effect be greater on them? Considered in an aggregate view, quite the reverse. In other words, if religion doesn't check people as individuals, then clearly it doesn't have any chance at all of checking their behavior as the member of a faction, especially a majority faction. The conduct of every popular assembly, Madison says, acting on oath. Every public body takes an oath to follow the law, to do what's right, to follow the will of the constituents, etc., etc., etc. People take that oath, and then they turn around and they violate it. The conduct of every popular assembly acting on oath, Madison said, the strongest of religious tests, provides that individuals join without remorse in acts against which their consciences would revolt if proposed to them under the like sanction separately in their closets. People will do things as members of groups, of factions, that they would never think about doing if they were alone. And then he talks about religious enthusiasm. Religion is one thing, but aggressive, enthusiastic religion is something else. When indeed, Madison says, religion is kindled into enthusiasm, its force, like that of other passions, is increased by the sympathy of a multitude. But enthusiasm is only a temporary state of religion, and while it lasts, will hardly be seen with pleasure at the helm of government. Besides, as religion in its coolest state is not infallible, it may become a motive to oppression as well as restraint from injustice. Religious enthusiasm can easily become oppression. People can become so carried away, so enthusiastic in religious purposes, that they are very comfortable violating the rights and the freedoms of other people who don't agree. Madison says, place 3 individuals in a situation wherein the interest of each depends on the voice of the others, and give to 2 of them an interest opposed to the rights of the third. Will the latter be secure? The prudence of every man would shun the danger. The rules and forms of justice suppose and guard against it. Will 2,000 in a like situation be less likely to encroach on the rights of 1,000? Madison is an example here. If you had 3 people and 2 of them have the same interest and 1 has a different interest, what chance does the 1 have? Now Madison says multiply that and say 3,000 people versus 1,000 people. What chance do the 1,000 have against the power, the overwhelming power of the 2,000? The contrary, Madison says, is witnessed by the notorious factions and oppressions which take place in corporate towns, limited as the opportunities are, and in little republics when uncontrolled by apprehensions of external danger. Small republics where majorities are possible means that self-interest will prevail and the rights of minorities will suffer. Always, Madison says. Now he gets into something that is familiar, ought to be familiar, because of Federalist number 10. If an enlargement of the sphere is found to lessen the insecurity of private rights, it is not because the impulse of a common interest or passion is less predominant in this case with the majority, but because a common interest or passion is less apt to be felt and the requisite combinations less easy to be formed by a great than by a small number. The society becomes broken into a greater variety of interests, of passions, which check each other, whilst those who may feel a common sentiment have less opportunity of communication and concert. It may be inferred that the inconveniences of populous states, contrary to the prevailing theory, are in proportion not to the extent, but to the narrowness of their limits. What Madison is saying here is the essence of what he says in Federalist number 10, when he says the solution of to the problems of pure democracy is a republic, is the theory of representation. And what Madison is saying is, contrary to popular belief, the smaller the republic, the more likely self-interest will prevail and the rights of minorities will be trampled upon. On the contrary, if you extend the sphere, you create so many competing passions and interests which check each other that it becomes impossible for the majorities to organize. And if they can't organize, then they can't govern. And if they can't govern, then they lose the opportunity to fulfill their self-interest. Thereby, the rights of the minority are protected. However, the missing element here is the reality that if the majority is not governing, then if you make it impossible for the majority to rule, then you are making it likely that the minority will rule. Somebody's going to call the shots. Somebody's going to pass the laws. And then Madison includes, at the end of this particular item, two what he calls desideratums. The great desideratum in government, Madison says. What does he mean by desideratum? He means, I believe, he means truth, accepted truth. The great desideratum, the great truth, or the essence, Madison says, is such a modification of the sovereignty as will render it sufficiently neutral between the different interests and factions to control one part of the society from invading the rights of another, and at the same time sufficiently controlled itself from setting up an interest adverse to that of the whole society. This is what Madison elaborates on in Federalist number 51 about using ambition to check ambition. By creating so many competing interest groups, factions, that they tend to control each other, to check each other. And if they are doing that, then the possibility of a majority faction becomes less and less of a threat. So let me read that sentence again, because this is a key one. The great desideratum of government, Madison says, is such a modification of the sovereignty as will render it sufficiently neutral between the different interests and factions to control one part of the society from invading the rights of another, and at the same time sufficiently controlled itself from setting up an interest adverse to that of the whole society. What Madison is talking about here, about modifying the sovereignty, is bleeding out of it self-interest. Trying to create a situation that when you get to the top and the important pieces of legislation are being debated and passed, they are being passed by people who are more likely to put the public interest first rather than their own private interest. Madison gives an example of that. He said, in absolute monarchies, the prince is sufficiently neutral toward his subjects, but frequently sacrifices their happiness to his ambition or his own avarice. The problem with absolute monarchies, he said, is that while they're not part of any one faction, they tend to have their own interest. And because of their power, they impose it. In small republics, the sovereign will is sufficiently controlled from such a sacrifice of the entire society, but is not sufficiently neutral towards the parts composing it. In a small republic, you have a much greater threat that there will be a majority faction. And by definition, majority faction is self-interest. That means that government is not neutral Government is not looking for or focusing on the public interest. Government instead is enacting the majority's private interest. So now Madison comes up with what he calls an auxiliary desideratum. In other words, a sub-truth to that truth. An auxiliary desideratum, Madison says, for the amelioration of the Republican form is such a process of elections as will most certainly extract from the mass of society the purest and noblest characters which it contains. The purpose of elections at different levels is that as you move up, we did this when we looked at the circles of hell, and we speculated, instead of going down into the depth of hell, imagine that we're coming up, level by level, each level representing an election. By the time you get to the top, you can identify the people who are successful at being elected at that level are people who are able to appeal to wider and wider enlarged spheres, wider interest groups. By definition, they're moderates. By definition, they are able to attract support from a wide variety of competing factions and competing interests. What that means is that they are never beholden to one. That in fact they are neutral when it comes to the different factions that make up their constituency. Their neutrality guarantees that the public interest will be their number one priority, not self-interest. So Madison talks about a process of elections as extracting from the mass of society the purest and noblest characters which it contains, such as will at once feel most strongly the proper motives to pursue the end of their appointment and be most capable to devise the proper means of attaining it. That's Madison's vices of the political system of the United States. That's the portion of it that pertains directly to Federalist Number 10. Obviously, Federalist Number 10 is written in a level of sophistication and lack of specificity which opens it more to interpretation. In this particular document, Madison is laying out exactly how it will work, so that when these people see Federalist 10 in the newspapers, they understand exactly what Madison is saying, even though those who never saw this document first would have no idea what Madison is really saying. They would focus instead on the violence of factions, on the hostility of rival parties, on the history of republics as being as violent in their deaths as they have been violent in their lives, etc., etc., all those other phrases that Madison uses. People who haven't been prepped by seeing this document first will likely not read well enough to be able to deduce this from Federalist Number 10. But those who have had this as a primer will understand exactly what Madison is meaning in Federalist Number 10. It is absolutely brilliant. It is a brilliant, not only a brilliant organizational strategy, it is a brilliant political strategy as well. We have almost reached the bottom of our first hour. It's 27 minutes after, so we have about 30 minutes left. in our program today. And I want to take as much of the time as we can in order to respond to and to thank two of our listeners for the emails that they sent on these particular issues, on these particular topics. I'm going to approach the shortest one first because I think we have the best chance of completing that today before the end of our program. It may be possible, it may be necessary that the other email we'll have to forego until after we resume our live broadcasts on the 8th of September. Because that particular email is so substantive and so heavy in its implications and its meaning that I think it warrants more time than we have left in our program today. So let me begin with first things first. First of all, let me identify both of our listeners by first names. The long one, the one that we're going to hold until second, is an email from our friend Harry in Baltimore. I have printed out the substance of that email. It prints out to close to 3.5 pages of material. That one, I think, we'll have to devote a good portion of a program to. The second, however, I was able to get on just a little bit over 1 page. This particular email I received this morning from our friend John, Dr. John. Let me share this email with you, because I think I would be remiss if I don't accurately give you the email as it was sent to me, because I wouldn't want to misinterpret the situation or to misinterpret the questions that John is asking. John says, "Good morning. I've been enjoying your discussion of Federalist number 10. And like most others in the audience, I'm seeing the founders in an entirely new light, thanks to your exegesis." I guess that means my analysis or my efforts to analyze. "I'm still a few days behind," he says, "but your programs have inspired me to try to approach events where I live in a slightly different way. And I wanted to put them to what I might call the Madison test and check my results with you. Let me explain." John says, "Here in upstate New York, a small but vocal group has been arguing through media buys, press conferences, and poorly documented studies and surveys that upstate New York is fundamentally different politically, culturally, and economically from the power base in Albany and New York City. And the only way to ensure minority rights is for upstate to secede and self-govern. A secession movement in upper New York, because the interests of the people there differ markedly from the interests of those in the power centers in New York, which is the state capital, Albany, and, of course, the power of New York's biggest city, New York City. What are these modern-day secessionists angry about? Two things primarily. First, New York State's ban on hydrofracking for natural gas. Second, the state's Secure Ammunition and Firearms Enforcement Act of 2013, commonly called the SAFE Act. Secure Ammunition and Firearms Enforcement, SAFE. The fracking ban, John says, was announced last year, and it effectively shuts down exotic gas drilling in New York. Some speculating landowners here consider it an unforgivable intrusion by government on property rights. The SAFE Act was passed following the Sandy Hook Elementary murders. It bans high-capacity magazines, requires background checks for ammunition purchases, and creates a state registry of assault weapons. The opposition is what you might expect. The claim is the SAFE Act infringes on Second Amendment rights. So those are the two issues. The right to subject your own property to fracking in order to extract natural gas. And of course the right to buy weapons without the background check and the registry for ammunition and all the rest of it. So in response, a group of landowners, gun rights advocates, pro-gas drillers, and the Oath Keepers group are suggesting upstate New York should secede from New York City and its immediate surrounding communities. The legal mechanisms are unclear, but the plan is a number of upstate counties would either join Pennsylvania or become a state of their own, at least to hear the secessionists talk about it. Of course, that brings to mind two examples of the same kind of situation in America's past. The first one, of course, is the rights of the southern states to secede from the Union with the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860. The second is the creation of the state of West Virginia in 1863 out of the state of Virginia, because West Virginia's interests were so different from the bulk of Virginia's interests. The bulk of power in 1860 in Virginia was held by the planter groups, by slave owners, and those in cities like Richmond and Northern Virginia and Alexandria and those places, where people made money on the various aspects of the slave trade, whether it was marketing tobacco, whether it was marketing slaves, whatever it might be. Obviously, the state of the mountains of West Virginia believed that the public interests of those in Western Virginia differed so markedly from the interests of those in mainstream Virginia that the situation justified the creation of its own separate state. Here's John's point. The discussion of Madison's writing on majorities and minorities, factions and public virtue, seems to bear directly on this issue. Rather than just dismiss these people as delusional, I thought I'd try to think about them in light of Federalist number 10, my Madison test, if you will. So, are these people among Madison's most considerate and virtuous citizens? Question mark. Are they exhibiting, as you put it on Facebook, a love of justice, wisdom, and patriotism? Unquote. The secessionists certainly think they are. Their rhetoric is all about ideals of freedom and democracy, minority rights being trampled by powerful politicians. But, John says, I doubt Madison would see it that way. I think Madison would see the secession movement as an abdication of the social compact. These people's problem is not with government per se. It's with how the government operated regarding two specific passions. In the case of fracking, it's money. In the case of the SAFE Act, guns. Having participated in the political process, they are not content with the outcome and are not willing to work through the typical procedures to gain redress. I think, John says, Madison would see this as a dangerous faction, hence one that is unsuited to hold the reins of power, and would oppose secession based on that. And then John asks me, do you think that's legitimate reasoning? I ask you that same question. In the situation that John lays out for us, about guns on the one hand and property rights on the other, the right to pursue fracking, the right to block government infringement on what you do with your own property, in the fact that by banning fracking, government is infringing on minority rights and property rights. Is this the same situation that Madison gives us in Federalist number 10? I guess the first question that John asks is, are these the most considerate and virtuous citizens? They think they are, John says. Would Madison think they are? I would suggest to you the first thing that comes to my mind, and I invite you to weigh in on this, if you would like to call, our phone number is, again, area code 304-663-4676. We still have 20 minutes left in our program, so there's plenty of time. And I don't know whether he's currently listening, but Bob Kincaid in our production studios is welcome to weigh in on this as well, obviously. I wonder where Madison would come down on this issue of the most considerate and virtuous citizens. In this particular case, would Madison be more inclined to support the state of New York in its banning of fracking and his requirement for registering guns and ammunition, would Madison believe that the most considerate and virtuous citizens are the secessionists seeking to leave New York and form their own state? Or, in Madison's mind, would the most considerate and virtuous citizens be those who passed the original legislation in the first place? In other words, where are the most considerate and virtuous citizens? Where's the virtue here? Is the virtue in the self-interest of the secessionists, or is the virtue in the reading of the public good by government which led to the passage of these particular pieces of legislation? And secondly, is secession a legitimate, viable option? If the majority is weighing in against you, our republic leaves open the opportunity to turn your point of view, your secessionist views, into the majority view. Is there any chance that you can do that? Or, in fact, is the decision to secede from the state of New York an acknowledgement on the part of the secessionists that they can't win legitimately, that they will never succeed in creating a majority vote to overturn the legislation that they oppose? Is state of New York's passing legislation banning fracking, is that an exercise of government's effort to pursue the public interest? Or is it an exercise of arbitrary, abusive government power that is infringing on the rights of minorities and the rights of property? I think that's the issue. Where would Madison come down on this? I genuinely believe that Madison would be on the side of the state of New York. I think Madison would take the same position in this debate as Lincoln took in the face of Southern secession after his election in 1860. If these secessionists want to secede because they don't believe that they have a chance of becoming the majority, then in effect they are denying the validity of majority rule. They are demanding minority rule. And if the minority can't rule, then their decision is to no longer play. If we can't win a vote, then we are free to decide that we don't like these rules anymore. Is that legitimate? I think it's a fantastic question. Again, to what extent is there evidence of self-interest in what government is doing? Madison lays out in 51, not number 10, but in 51, two different scenarios. And that is that the competing factions, the competing interest groups, will be so competitive that they'll be able to check each other. In other words, no one of them will be able to get control over the others. But at the same time, Madison raises another concern. And that is the extent to which government can become an interest group in its own right. In theory, Madison says, republicanism requires that government be neutral and that it not side with particular groups or particular factions against others within its own society if it expects to win the support and endorsement and patriotism of its own citizens. The only way that all citizens can continue to support government is if they really believe that it's neutral. If they believe that government is a faction in and of itself, that government has its own interest, then it seems to me that the argument of government infringement on minority rights and property rights becomes somewhat valid. But if government's position is driven by an effort to promote the public interest, if government believes that all citizens in the state of New York will be better off if fracking is not allowed within the state, then government is enacting its obligations, its legitimate responsibilities to pursue the public interest against the interest of this minority. But the truth, the reality is that if the minority is in the minority, does it have the right to withdraw from the process entirely and set up its own state? I really ask you to think about these questions. For example, when the original settlers, let's be specific here. Let's talk about the Puritans who come to Massachusetts in 1630 under the leadership of John Winthrop. The first group that came, about 1,000 of them, entire families, whole congregations, church congregations, they came as organized bodies, religious congregations. They came here because they did not believe that their freedom to worship in England was possible. So they decided to come over here and set up their own society based on their right to worship God as they chose to. They came here for their own religious freedom. But in the colony or the government that they set up in Massachusetts, not for 1 second did they accept the right of other minorities to worship God as they chose within this particular society. They hung the Quakers. They expelled the Quakers. They felt that it was totally within their rights to deny religious freedom to others, at the same time that they felt that their religious freedom gave them the right to come over here and set up their own ideal society. So is it principle that these people are operating under? Or is it self-interest? I think all of us need to think about that. If these people are successful in seceding from the state of New York and setting up their own state, clearly it would be a state that allowed fracking. Clearly it would be a state that didn't have any gun laws or gun registration laws or ammunition laws or anything like that. Assault rifles would be readily available in this new state. Within the United States of America, is it possible to condone these kinds of self-interest? Is it possible to concede to these particular passions? Madison says in Federalist number 55 that in a republic, the majority, a reasoned majority, has the right to dictate to government. Government must respond and respect the will of a reasoned majority. Government must respond to reason. But on the other hand, Madison says, government should never respond to passion. Government must respond to reason. Government must control passion. Because if you give in to these kinds of passions and these kinds of self-interest, you would literally destroy the society itself. I think it's an absolutely fantastic dilemma. I think this is a question that government students could well gain tremendous understanding and knowledge about the system by confronting these kinds of questions. I would suggest to you that the difference between a government class driven by these kinds of questions as opposed to a government class driven by a particular curriculum agenda which says students will be taught this and students will be taught that and students will be told this and students will be told that, and their option is to memorize it as unquestioned or unchallenged truth. I think the answer is pretty obvious. In the comments that I've made previously about Common Core, I think this to many people is the threat of Common Core. Is that Common Core promises more of this in our classrooms and less of the rote memorization of information, of alien information. We don't have that much time left. We've only got about 3 minutes left in our program today, so I don't want to pursue. I'm not even going to try to touch on Harry's until we get back together again in a couple of weeks, but 2 weeks from today. But let me, for a second, just in a moment or two that's left, let me speculate on the creation of the state of West Virginia. I've never done this research. I have never taught West Virginia history. I have good friends who do. One of my closest friends, and many of you will know Keith Lilly, who I went through the PRISM grants with, 2 grants, and we did our chats, live chats together on the internet. Keith is one of the finest West Virginia history instructors I've ever met. This is only speculation on my part. I don't know. I haven't done the research. I just wonder about the creation of the state of West Virginia. I have asked Keith this question, but he told me that honestly he doesn't know. This is my question. Was the independence movement within West Virginia a movement of particular individuals within the state of West Virginia, or was the independent movement to separate from Virginia receiving support, maybe even funding, from outside Virginia, outside what will become the state of West Virginia? To what extent were there interests in the North that saw a vested interest in encouraging West Virginia's secession from the state of Virginia? I'm thinking specifically of coal. Those people who saw power and money in the extraction of coal in West Virginia could never realize their goals as long as decisions about West Virginia was being made in Richmond by people who had little, if any, interest in the extraction of coal or timber or anything else. But there were clearly a lot of investors in the North, in the big cities of the Northeast, who saw tremendous potential for profit in marketing and extracting the coal and the natural resources from West Virginia. But you could never pull it off as long as West Virginia remained part of Virginia. So the real goal in West Virginia's independence from Virginia was to create West Virginia's perpetual dependence on out-of-state investors in West Virginia's natural resources. In effect, the creation of the independent state of West Virginia, in effect, became permanent colonial status for the citizens of West Virginia. That's a theory that I have. I've never done the research. I've never had the time to do the research. I would love to do it because I think there's a lot of evidence in other places that substantiates the validity of that kind of analysis. It is 3 p.m. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful time. Remember, we'll be gone for a couple of weeks. Be safe and plan to join us when we come back. Thank you.